I arrived at my wife's fashion brand launch. The models giggled. "The wallet is here." She handed me papers. "I'm famous now. I don't need a nobody husband. Sign the divorce and leave." I walked out quietly. I called the bank, froze the business accounts, and revoked the trademark I owned. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with 38 missing calls. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow this story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." Chapter 1. The Humiliation. I stood in the elevator ascending to the 42nd floor of the Skyline building, watching the numbers climb while my stomach dropped with each passing floor. The invitation in my jacket pocket felt heavier than it should have. Cream-colored cardstock with Bethany's new brand logo embossed in gold. "Be there for my moment," she had said 3 weeks ago, her voice carrying that familiar tone she used when she wanted something, not "our moment" or "come celebrate with me." My moment. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the ballroom that would change everything. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, city lights twinkling like scattered diamonds against the darkening sky. The marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, each surface reflecting the warm glow of carefully positioned spotlights. The scent of expensive champagne mixed with designer perfumes hung in the air, creating an atmosphere that screamed luxury. Luxury I had funded for the past 6 months. I stepped into the crowd, my modest gray suit making me feel invisible among the fashion elite. Models glided past in Bethany's latest designs, their movements practiced and deliberate. Photographers snapped away while journalists scribbled notes, documenting what was supposed to be my wife's triumphant entrance into the fashion world. Her dream, supported by $350,000 of my money. The murmurs started almost immediately. "Oh, look, the wallet finally showed up," I heard one of the models whisper to another, her voice dripping with amusement. She was tall, probably 19 or 20, wearing a flowing red dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her friend giggled, a sound like breaking glass. "Bethany said he'd come running when she called," the second model replied, adjusting the diamond earrings that caught the light. "Men like that always do. No backbone, just a checkbook." I kept walking, my face neutral, though something cold was settling in my chest. 26 years of marriage, and this was how my wife spoke about me to strangers. I pulled out my phone and quietly activated the recording app, a habit I had developed over the past 18 months. Documentation, my lawyer had advised. Always document everything. The crowd parted as I made my way through the ballroom, and I caught fragments of conversations that made my jaw clench tighter with each step. Investors discussing Bethany's brilliant vision while sipping champagne that cost $200 a bottle. Fashion bloggers praising her independent spirit and self-made success. If only they knew the truth about who had made all of this possible. I found Bethany near the main display, surrounded by admirers like a queen holding court. At 47, she was still striking, auburn hair perfectly styled, emerald green dress hugging her figure, diamond jewelry sparkling under the lights. Every piece of that jewelry had been a gift from me, purchased during better times when I still believed in us. She saw me approaching, and her smile shifted, becoming sharp and predatory. The conversations around her quieted as she stepped forward, her $3,000 heels clicking against the marble floor with authority. "Glenn," she said, her voice carrying across the immediate area, "how wonderful that you could make time for this little gathering. Little gathering, as if 300 guests, catered food, open bar, and a venue rental of $85,000 constituted something small and insignificant." I forced a smile, the same patient expression I'd worn for years whenever she decided to remind me of my place. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied quietly. "Congratulations on everything you've accomplished." She tilted her head, studying me with those green eyes that had once made me forget my own name. Now they held nothing but calculation and barely concealed contempt. "Oh, this is just the beginning," she said, reaching into her small designer clutch. "Actually, I'm so glad you're here. I have something for you." The conversations around us stopped entirely. I could feel dozens of eyes watching, phones being raised to record whatever was about to happen. The photographers sensed drama and moved closer, their cameras ready to capture what they suspected would be a moment worth documenting. Bethany pulled out a manila envelope, thick, with papers, and held it out to me with a smile that never reached her eyes. My heart started pounding as I recognized what it was before I even took it. The weight of the envelope felt like holding my own execution warrant. "What's this?" I asked, though I already knew. "Freedom," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "For both of us." I opened the envelope with steady hands, though inside I felt like I was falling. Divorce papers, every page meticulously prepared, every detail planned to her advantage. She had been working on this for months, maybe longer. The petition cited irreconcilable differences and requested spousal support, half of all assets, and exclusive use of our Westchester home. "I'm famous now, Glenn," she announced, her voice carrying a note of triumph. "I don't need a nobody husband dragging me down anymore. Just sign the papers and leave quietly. It's the least you can do after everything I've given up for you." Everything she had given up for me. The irony was so thick I could taste it. She had given up nothing except the pretense of loving me. I had given up my youth, my dreams, my financial security, and my self-respect to build the life she was now using to discard me. The crowd was completely silent now, everyone watching this public execution with the kind of fascination people have for car accidents. I could see phones recording, capturing every moment of my humiliation for social media posterity. Tomorrow, this would be everywhere, the pathetic husband getting dumped at his wife's success party. One of the models from earlier stepped closer, barely suppressing her laughter. "This is so awkward," she whispered to her friend, but loud enough for me to hear. "Should someone call him an Uber?" "Or security," the friend replied with a snicker, "in case he makes a scene." I looked down at the papers in my hands, processing the carefully worded legal language that would strip away everything I had worked for. She wanted the house, the cars, ongoing financial support, and half of what she believed were our joint assets. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment for almost 2 years. The first hint had come during a dinner at Chez Laurent, our usual Friday night restaurant. I had been waiting for her to finish shopping at the boutiques nearby when I overheard her phone conversation with someone named Marcus. The words, "when I finally dump Glenn," and "stupid enough to pay for everything," had been like ice water in my veins. That night I had started making quiet inquiries and discoveries that changed everything. I slowly folded the divorce papers and placed them back in the envelope. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see how the humiliated husband would react. Would I beg? Would I cause a scene? Would I break down and give them the dramatic finale they were all hoping for? Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out my phone. Not the latest iPhone that Bethany always insisted I needed to keep up appearances, but my old, reliable device that she constantly mocked for being outdated. What she didn't know was that this phone contained the contacts and access codes that controlled more money than anyone in this room could imagine. "You know what, Bethany?" I said, my voice calm and steady. "You're absolutely right." Her eyebrows raised slightly. She had expected anger, tears, desperate pleas for another chance. She hadn't expected agreement. "I am going to leave quietly," I continued, watching confusion flicker across her face. "But first I need to make a couple of phone calls." I dialed the first number from memory, turning slightly away from the crowd but speaking clearly enough for those nearby to hear. The call connected immediately. "Richard, it's Glenn Morrison. Yes, it's time. Freeze everything immediately." I could hear Richard Sterling, my lawyer and friend of 20 years, clicking away at his keyboard. "Business accounts?" "All of them, and initiate the trademark reversions we discussed." "Consider it done. The papers are already filed." Bethany's face was starting to change, the confident smile fading as she realized this wasn't going according to her script. The crowd sensed something shifting, the energy in the room becoming electric with anticipation. I ended the first call and immediately dialed the second number. This one rang twice before a professional voice answered. Morrison Holdings, Sarah Kim speaking. Sarah, it's Glenn. Execute the contingency plan we discussed. All accounts, all holdings, effective immediately. I'll have everything transferred within the hour, Sarah replied, her voice crisp and efficient. Should I proceed with the secondary measures? Yes. And Sarah, thank you for everything. As I ended the second call, I could see Bethany's face had gone pale beneath her makeup. She was smart enough to understand that something was happening, something she hadn't anticipated. The models and guests nearby were exchanging confused glances, sensing drama but not understanding what they were witnessing. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and looked at my wife, soon-to-be ex-wife, for what I knew would be one of the last times. In the crystal chandelier light with the city sparkling behind her, she looked smaller somehow, less powerful, more afraid. The papers will be processed within 48 hours, I said quietly, my voice carrying just enough for the immediate crowd to hear. I hope you enjoy your moment, Bethany. I hope it was worth everything. I turned and walked toward the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet ballroom. Behind me, I could hear Bethany's voice rising with panic and confusion, but I didn't look back. The elevator doors opened immediately, as if the universe was finally cooperating with my plans. As the doors closed and the elevator began its descent, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal. For the first time in years, I looked like a man who knew his own worth. My phone buzzed in my pocket, the first of what would be 38 missed calls over the next hour, but I wasn't going to answer. Not tonight. Tonight, Bethany would learn what it felt like to be powerless, to have the ground disappear beneath her feet without warning. Tonight, she would discover that the nobody husband she had discarded so casually had been the foundation holding up her entire world. The elevator reached the ground floor and I stepped out into the cool Manhattan evening air. Behind me, 42 floors up, my old life was ending in confusion and panic. Ahead of me lay the rest of my story, one that would finally be written on my own terms. That was just the beginning. Chapter 2. The First Move. I drove through the empty streets of Manhattan in my 15-year-old Honda Civic, the same car Bethany had begged me to replace dozens of times because it embarrassed her in front of important people. Tonight it felt like freedom. No car payments, no image to maintain, no one to impress. Just me and the reliable engine that had never let me down, unlike the woman I had spent 26 years trying to please. My phone had been vibrating non-stop for the past 40 minutes, 38 missed calls, 15 voicemails, and 63 text messages. I knew without looking that they were all from Bethany, probably escalating from confusion to anger to panic as she began to understand what was happening. I had turned off the ringer after the first few calls, preferring the silence that allowed me to think clearly for the first time in years. The drive to my house, our house, though not for much longer, gave me time to process what I had just done. For 26 months, ever since that night at Chez Laurent when I overheard her conversation, I had been planning for this moment. Richard Sterling had helped me understand the legal implications of quietly moving assets and protecting myself from someone who saw me only as a financial resource. What Bethany didn't know was that I had been documenting everything. Her spending habits, her treatment of me, her various affairs, and most importantly, her complete lack of legal claim to most of what she considered our money. I pulled into the driveway of our Westchester home, a colonial-style house worth approximately $1.2 million. Bethany had fallen in love with it during an open house 7 years ago, gushing about the marble countertops, the walk-in closets, and the prestige of the address. What she hadn't paid attention to was whose name appeared on the mortgage documents, whose credit had secured the loan, and who had made every single payment for the past 7 years. The house was dark except for the automatic security lights that illuminated my path to the front door. Bethany would be trapped at her launch party for at least another 3 hours, trying to manage the crisis that was undoubtedly unfolding as vendors, suppliers, and service providers began receiving calls about frozen accounts. I had time to prepare for the conversation that would inevitably come. I walked through the front door and was immediately hit by the familiar scent of Bethany's expensive perfume, a custom blend that cost $800 per bottle and had to be special ordered from a boutique in Paris. The scent lingered throughout the house, a constant reminder of her presence even when she wasn't home. Tonight, instead of comfort, it felt suffocating. My footsteps echoed on the hardwood floors as I made my way to my home office in the basement. This was my sanctuary, the one room in the house that Bethany rarely entered because it didn't meet her aesthetic standards. The wood paneling was too masculine, the leather furniture was outdated, and my collection of business books was boring. She preferred the bright, open spaces upstairs where she could display the expensive artwork and furniture I had purchased to make her happy. I settled into my leather chair and opened the filing cabinet that contained 2 years of careful preparation. Bank statements showing the gradual transfer of funds to accounts she didn't know existed. Legal documents establishing my sole ownership of intellectual property and business entities. Voice recordings of conversations where she spoke about me with contempt and cruelty. Photographs of her with Marcus Chen, the fashion photographer who had been her latest affair partner for the past 8 months. The first document I pulled out was the real divorce petition, the one I had filed 6 weeks ago through Richard's office. While Bethany had been planning her public humiliation of me, I had been quietly documenting her adultery, her financial irresponsibility, and her systematic emotional abuse. In New York State, fault-based divorce was still possible, and I had more than enough evidence to ensure that her dreams of taking half of everything would remain just dreams. My computer chimed with an email notification. Sarah Kim, my business partner and the one person who truly understood the scope of what I had built, had completed the asset transfers. $4.3 million in various accounts and investments were now completely beyond Bethany's reach. The fashion brand she thought was hers existed only because I owned the trademark, the business license, and the intellectual property rights. As of tonight, Bethany Morrison Designs no longer legally belonged to Bethany Morrison. I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the phone calls I had made from the ballroom. The first call to Richard had triggered the freezing of all business accounts associated with the brand launch. The catering company wouldn't be paid. The venue rental was now in default. The model's fees would bounce. Every vendor and supplier who had trusted Bethany's promises would discover that she had no legal authority to access the funds she had promised them. The second call to Sarah had been even more devastating. Sarah had spent 2 years helping me establish a complex network of business entities and investments that Bethany knew nothing about. While I played the role of the passive, accommodating husband, I had been building an empire that existed completely outside of our marriage. Sarah owned 49% of Morrison Holdings, our primary investment vehicle, while I owned 51%. Bethany had never even heard the company name. My phone buzzed with a text message, breaking through my thoughts. Against my better judgment, I glanced at the screen. "Glenn, what the hell is happening? The caterers are saying our account is frozen. Call me immediately." Then another, "This isn't funny. People are asking questions. Fix this now." And another, "I know you're getting these messages. Stop being childish and answer your phone." The messages kept coming, each one more frantic than the last. I could picture her at the party, trying to maintain her composure while everything fell apart around her. The guests who had been celebrating her success were probably starting to ask uncomfortable questions. The investors who had been impressed by her presentation were likely reconsidering their commitments. The models who had mocked me as the wallet were discovering that the wallet had just walked away. I set my phone aside and pulled out another folder, this one containing financial records that would shock Bethany if she ever saw them. For the past 5 years, I had been paying her credit card bills that averaged $28,000 per month. Designer clothes, luxury spa treatments, expensive dinners with friends, vacations to Europe and Asia that she took without me because I was too boring to appreciate fine culture. She had been living like a millionaire while treating me like a servant, never realizing that her lifestyle depended entirely on my continued generosity. What she also didn't know was that I had been tracking every dollar she spent, categorizing each purchase, and building a comprehensive picture of someone who viewed marriage as a financial convenience rather than a partnership. The evidence would be devastating in divorce court, especially combined with the documentation of her affairs and her systematic emotional abuse. I opened my laptop and reviewed the timeline Sarah and I had created for tonight's operation. Phase 1, freezing the immediate accounts, was complete. Phase 2 would begin tomorrow, when Bethany discovered that her personal credit cards were also frozen and that her access to our joint checking account had been revoked. Phase 3 would unfold over the following weeks as she learned the true scope of what she had lost by treating me as disposable. My phone rang, startling me from my planning. Bethany's name appeared on the screen, along with a photo from our honeymoon in Italy 26 years ago. We had been happy then, or at least I had thought we were. Looking back now, I could see the signs that I had ignored. The way she had insisted on the most expensive restaurants and hotels, the way she had spent our honeymoon shopping rather than exploring together, the way she had already begun treating our marriage as a financial transaction rather than a romantic partnership. I let the call go to voicemail, then listened to the message she left. "Glenn, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, but it needs to stop right now. You're embarrassing me in front of very important people. The party is falling apart because vendors are claiming they can't get paid. I need you to fix this immediately. I know you're upset about the divorce papers, but this is incredibly immature. We can discuss the terms later, but right now I need you to handle the financial situation. That's what you do, Glenn. That's your job in this relationship." Even in crisis, even when her world was collapsing, she couldn't resist reminding me of my place. I was the money, I was the problem solver, I was the reliable foundation that she could take for granted while she pursued her dreams and her affairs. The message confirmed everything I had learned about her over the past 2 years. She truly believed that I existed to serve her ambitions while having no value beyond my bank account. I deleted the voicemail and opened a new folder on my computer. This one contained research Sarah had helped me compile about Marcus Chen, Bethany's affair partner. Marcus was 34 years old, a moderately successful fashion photographer who specialized in working with emerging designers. What Bethany didn't know was that Marcus was also deeply in debt, having spent beyond his means to maintain the lifestyle that attracted women like her. His photography studio was 3 months behind on rent, his equipment was leased, rather than owned, and his reputation in the industry was built more on charm than talent. More importantly, Marcus had been pursuing Bethany not out of love, but because he believed she had access to serious money. I had discovered through a mutual acquaintance that Marcus had been asking questions about my net worth, my business interests, and my willingness to invest in fashion-related ventures. He saw Bethany as his path to financial security, just as she saw him as her path to a more exciting life. They were both users, both predators, both convinced they were smarter than the people they were manipulating. The irony was exquisite. Bethany thought she was leaving me for a more exciting man who appreciated her artistic vision. Marcus thought he was seducing a wealthy woman who could fund his dreams. Neither of them understood that they were both parasites who had been feeding off my success while contributing nothing of value to anyone's life. My computer chimed again with another email from Sarah. Phase 1 complete. All accounts frozen, all access revoked. Bethany Morrison has zero legal authority over any business assets as of 11:45 p.m. The trademark cancellation will be processed by Monday morning. Are you ready for Phase 2? I typed back. Proceed with Phase 2 at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Make sure she discovers the personal account situation when she tries to pay for her morning coffee. I want the reality to hit her gradually, not all at once. Sarah's response came immediately. Understood. Glenn, I know this is difficult, but you're doing the right thing. She never deserved you. Sarah Kim had been my business partner for 6 years, helping me build investments and ventures that Bethany never knew existed. She was brilliant, loyal, and had watched with growing disgust as Bethany treated me with increasing contempt over the years. Sarah understood business, understood money, and understood that success required both intelligence and integrity, qualities that Bethany had never possessed. What Bethany also didn't understand was that Sarah and I had developed feelings for each other over the past year. Nothing inappropriate had happened while I was married, but the emotional connection was undeniable. Sarah saw me as a man worthy of respect and partnership, not as a wallet with legs. She appreciated my mind, my work ethic, and my character in ways that Bethany never had. When this divorce was finalized, Sarah and I would have the opportunity to explore what we meant to each other without the shadow of my toxic marriage hanging over us. My phone buzzed with another text from Bethany. "Glenn, I'm leaving the party now. We need to talk immediately. This has gone far enough." I smiled, imagining her trying to maintain her composure as her triumph turned into humiliation. The guests who had been celebrating her success were probably spreading gossip throughout the fashion industry about her financial problems. The investors who had been courting her were likely having second thoughts. The vendors who had trusted her were probably demanding payment before providing any additional services. For 26 years, I had protected her from consequences. I had paid her bills, cleaned up her mistakes, and enabled her to live in a fantasy world where her desires mattered more than reality. Tonight, for the first time, she was experiencing what it felt like to face problems that money couldn't immediately solve, especially when the money wasn't hers to begin with. I looked around my office at the books and files and computers that represented the real foundation of our life together. Everything in this room had been purchased with money I earned, organized according to systems I created, and used to build a future that Bethany had been planning to steal from me. Tonight, she would discover that she had miscalculated badly. The woman who thought she was discarding a nobody husband was about to learn that she had just destroyed her own life. Chapter 3. The Truth Emerges. I heard Bethany's car screaming up our driveway at 12:47 a.m., the engine of her BMW revving higher than necessary, a sound that had always announced her emotional state. Tonight it sounded like pure panic. I remained in my office chair, surrounded by the evidence of 26 months of careful planning, listening to her heels clicking frantically across the hardwood floors above me. "Glenn," her voice echoed through the house, shrill and desperate. "Glenn, where are you? We need to talk right now." I could hear her moving through the rooms upstairs, probably checking the bedroom first, then the living room, then the kitchen. She would save the basement office for last because she had always avoided this space, claiming it was too dark and depressing for her taste. What she had never understood was that this humble room had been the command center for an empire she never knew existed. The footsteps stopped directly above me. Then I heard the basement door open. Her heels on the wooden stairs sounded like gunshots in the quiet house. "There you are," she said, appearing at the bottom of the stairs, slightly out of breath. Her perfect makeup was smudged, her designer dress wrinkled, and her usually flawless hair was disheveled. For the first time in years, she looked her actual age, 47 years old and completely out of control. I looked up from my computer screen calmly, as if she had just returned from a grocery store run rather than a catastrophic business disaster. "How was the party?" I asked, my voice neutral. She stared at me for a long moment, her green eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and fury. "How was the party? Glenn, what the hell did you do?" The entire event collapsed. Vendors demanding immediate payment, the venue threatening to shut us down, investors backing out. It was a complete disaster. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. Even in crisis, even facing the destruction of everything she had worked toward, her first instinct was to blame me rather than accept responsibility for her own actions. It was classic Bethany. Consequences were always someone else's fault. "I didn't do anything to your party," I said quietly. "I simply stopped paying for it." "You can't just stop paying," she snapped, moving closer to my desk. "We had agreements with those people, contracts, legal obligations." "You had agreements," I corrected. "Contracts that you signed, legal obligations that you created. I never authorized any of those expenditures, Bethany. You just assumed that my money would always be available to cover your dreams." She blinked rapidly, processing what I was saying. But the business accounts were in my name. The trademark for your brand is registered to my company. The venue booking was guaranteed by my credit. Everything you thought was yours was actually mine, and tonight I took it back. The color drained from her face as the reality began to sink in. She had spent months planning this launch, networking with investors, promising vendors that she could pay for their services, building a public image as an independent entrepreneur. What she had never bothered to investigate was the legal foundation of her own business. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I registered the company myself. I filed all the paperwork." I turned my computer monitor toward her, showing the trademark registration database. Bethany Morrison Designs was listed as a subsidiary of Morrison Holdings, LLC. My signature appeared on all the official documents. Her name appeared nowhere in the legal ownership structure. "You registered a DBA, a doing business as entity," I explained patiently. "That gives you the right to use the name but not to own it. The actual trademark, the business license, the intellectual property rights, all of that belongs to Morrison Holdings, which is my company." She stared at the screen, her mouth opening and closing without sound. For someone who had spent years dismissing me as a boring businessman who didn't understand creativity and vision, she had been remarkably careless about the business side of her own venture. "You can't do this," she said, her voice rising. "I put my heart into that brand, my designs, my vision, my work." "Your work?" I interrupted, opening another folder on my desk. "Let's talk about your work." I pulled out a stack of invoices and receipts, documentation of every expense related to her fashion brand over the past 18 months. Fabric sourcing, $47,000. Pattern development, $23,000. Sample creation, $36,000. Marketing and promotion, $68,000. Website development and photography, $29,000. $350,000, I said, spreading the papers across my desk. "That's what your work has cost so far. Every fabric sample, every design consultation, every marketing campaign, all of it paid for with my money. Your contribution was picking colors and telling people what you wanted them to create for you." Bethany's hands were trembling as she reached for one of the invoices. "But I thought, we're married. What's yours is mine, right?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that what you thought when you were planning to divorce me? When you handed me those papers in front of 300 people? When you told everyone I was a nobody husband you didn't need anymore? Did you think about our marriage being a partnership then?" She had no answer for that. The legal papers on my desk told the story she didn't want to acknowledge. This had been her plan for months, maybe years. The divorce petition she had prepared requested immediate possession of our house, ongoing spousal support, and half of all marital assets. She had calculated that destroying me publicly would give her leverage in the divorce proceedings, forcing me to accept her terms rather than fight a lengthy battle. What she hadn't calculated was that I had been preparing for this moment since the night I overheard her conversation at Chez Laurent. "Glenn," she said, her voice taking on the honey-sweet tone she used when she wanted something expensive. "I know you're hurt. I know the divorce papers were a shock, but we can work this out. We can renegotiate the terms, make it more fair for both of us." I opened another folder and pulled out a different set of legal documents, the ones that would truly destroy her world. "These are the divorce papers I filed 6 weeks ago," I said, sliding them across the desk. "Before your launch party, before your public humiliation of me, before you thought you had all the leverage." Her eyes widened as she scanned the documents. Unlike her petition, which had been based on no-fault irreconcilable differences, mine cited specific grounds: adultery, abandonment, and cruel treatment. Each charge was supported by detailed evidence: photographs, voice recordings, financial records, and witness statements. "You've been planning this," she whispered, the papers shaking in her hands. "For 2 years," I confirmed. "Ever since I realized that you saw me as nothing more than a financial resource. Ever since I understood that you were already planning to discard me the moment you thought you didn't need my money anymore." I pulled out my phone and played one of the recorded conversations, her voice crystal clear, talking to her friend Vivian Torres about her divorce plans. "Once I'm established in the fashion world, I won't need to pretend anymore," her recorded voice said. "Glenn is useful for paying bills, but he's so boring. No ambition, no passion, no excitement. I'm wasting the best years of my life being married to someone who thinks success means making spreadsheets." I stopped the recording and looked at her face. She had gone completely pale, realizing that her private conversations had been documented and could be used against her in court. "How many recordings do you have?" she asked quietly. "Enough," I replied. "Conversations with your friends about how much you despise being married to me. Phone calls with Marcus Chen planning your affair. Discussions with your divorce attorney about hiding assets and maximizing your settlement. 2 years of evidence that you view marriage as a business transaction where you provide nothing and take everything." She sank into the chair across from my desk, finally understanding the scope of what was happening. This wasn't an emotional reaction to being served with divorce papers. This was a carefully orchestrated response to years of systematic abuse and exploitation. "The affair with Marcus," I continued, pulling out another folder. "I have photographs, hotel receipts, restaurant bills, all paid for with my credit cards. By the way, you used my money to fund your relationship with your lover. That level of contempt for your marriage vows will be very interesting to a judge." Bethany's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. "Glenn, please. We can fix this. I can change. We can go to counseling." "Like we did 3 years ago?" I asked, referring to the brief period when she had agreed to marriage therapy, only to spend every session explaining to the counselor why all of our problems were my fault. "Where you told Dr. Martinez that I was emotionally unavailable because I worked too much to support your lifestyle. Where you claimed I didn't understand your creative needs while using my credit cards to buy $15,000 handbags?" I opened my laptop and showed her the financial analysis Sarah had prepared, a breakdown of every dollar she had spent over the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering. Designer clothing, $147,000. Luxury vacations, $93,000. Spa treatments and beauty services, $68,000. Expensive dinners and entertainment, $54,000. Art and home decoration, $82,000. $444,000, I said, letting the number hang in the air between us. "That's what your lifestyle has cost over the past 5 years, not including the house, the cars, or the daily expenses, just your personal shopping, entertainment, and self-indulgence. But you never complained," she whispered, as if that somehow justified the excess. "I never complained because I believed you loved me," I replied. "I thought I was making sacrifices to make my wife happy. I didn't understand that I was just funding the lifestyle of someone who was planning to discard me the moment she found something better." My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. "Phase 2 complete. All personal accounts frozen, credit cards canceled. She'll discover the full extent when she tries to use them tomorrow." Bethany saw me reading the message and grabbed my arm. "Glenn, you can't cut off my access to money. I have appointments tomorrow. I have obligations." "You have the same access to money that you've always had," I said, gently removing her hand from my arm. "Your own money. The money you've earned through your own work and your own efforts. Oh, wait, you don't have any of that, do you?" The realization hit her like a physical blow. She had no independent income, no personal savings, no assets in her own name. For 26 years, she had lived entirely off my earnings while contributing nothing to our financial security. Even her fashion brand had been funded entirely by my money and existed only because I had provided the legal and financial infrastructure. "I need time to figure things out," she said, desperation creeping into her voice. "I can't just be cut off from everything overnight." "You'll have time," I assured her. "The divorce proceedings will take several months. During that time, you're welcome to find employment, establish your own credit, and create your own financial independence. Think of it as a learning experience." She stared at me, as if I had suddenly started speaking a foreign language. The concept of working for money, of being responsible for her own expenses, of living within her means, These were ideas that had never occurred to her during our marriage. "But what about the house?" she asked. "Where am I supposed to live?" I pulled out the mortgage documents and property deed, both of which showed only my name. "This house belongs to me. It was purchased with my money using my credit, and I've made every single payment for the past 7 years. You're welcome to stay in the guest room until you find other arrangements, but as of tonight, you're a tenant, not an owner." The transformation in her face was remarkable. The arrogant, contemptuous woman who had humiliated me in front of 300 people just hours ago had been replaced by someone who looked lost and vulnerable. For the first time in our marriage, she was experiencing what it felt like to be powerless. "This isn't over," she said, trying to summon some of her old authority. "I'll fight you in court. I'll expose everything you've done." "Please do," I replied calmly. "I'm looking forward to having this conversation in front of a judge. You can explain to them how you believe you're entitled to half of everything I've earned while you've spent 26 years contributing nothing but criticism and contempt." She stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over the chair. "You're going to regret this, Glenn. I'm not some helpless victim you can just discard." "You're right," I agreed. "You're not helpless. You're a 47-year-old woman with a college degree and 26 years of marriage to someone who would have supported any genuine effort you made to build something meaningful. The fact that you chose to build nothing, to contribute nothing, to become nothing but an expensive decoration for my life, those were your choices." She turned and walked toward the stairs, her heels clicking with less authority than when she had arrived. At the bottom of the steps, she paused and looked back at me. "Who are you?" she asked quietly. "This isn't the man I married." I met her gaze steadily. "You're right, the man you married was weak enough to enable your selfishness and naive enough to believe you loved him. That man is gone." She disappeared up the stairs, leaving me alone with the evidence of her betrayal and the satisfaction of knowing that justice was finally being served. Tomorrow she would discover that her credit cards had been canceled and her access to our joint accounts had been revoked. She would learn what it felt like to be truly powerless for the first time in her adult life. And I would begin building the future I should have started creating 26 years ago. Chapter 4. The Empire Revealed. 3 days after the catastrophic launch party, I sat in Sarah Kim's corner office on the 37th floor of the Meridian building, watching Bethany's world continue its spectacular collapse through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Manhattan's financial district. The morning light streaming through the glass illuminated the stack of legal documents spread across Sarah's mahogany conference table, evidence of an empire that Bethany was only beginning to understand. Sarah poured coffee from an elegant silver service, her movements precise and professional. At 38, she possessed the kind of understated competence that had made her one of the most successful private wealth managers in the city. Her dark hair was pulled back in a sleek bun, and her charcoal gray suit projected an authority that came from managing hundreds of millions of dollars in client assets. What Bethany had never known was that Sarah had been managing my assets for 6 years, building a financial foundation that existed completely separate from my marriage. "The media response has been interesting," Sarah said, sliding a tablet across the table. The screen displayed several fashion industry websites with headlines like "Bethany Morrison brand launch ends in financial disaster" and "New designer's debut collapses amid payment issues." The articles were carefully worded to avoid legal liability, but the message was clear. Bethany had promised more than she could deliver, and the industry was taking notice. I scrolled through the articles, noting how the narrative was being shaped. None of the reporters understood the real story. They saw only the surface, a new designer whose business model had failed, not the systematic deception that had been exposed. What they didn't know was that every vendor contract, every venue agreement, every service provider arrangement had been signed by someone who had no legal authority to access the funds needed to fulfill those obligations. "Has she tried to contact you directly?" Sarah asked, settling into her chair with the easy confidence of someone who had spent years building genuine success, rather than living off someone else's achievements. 47 times since Monday, I replied, setting down the tablet. Calls, texts, emails, even showed up at the office yesterday, but security handled it. She's discovering that desperation doesn't create money or legal authority. Sarah smiled, but there was no cruelty in it, just the satisfaction of someone who had watched an abuser finally face consequences. She had witnessed Bethany's treatment of me during business dinners and social events over the years. The casual dismissals, the public criticism, the way Bethany would introduce me as my husband who pays for everything, as if I were a walking ATM rather than a human being. "Show me the full scope," I said, opening my laptop to review the financial structures we had built together. Sarah pulled up a comprehensive presentation on her computer, then projected it onto the large screen mounted on the office wall. What appeared was an organizational chart that would have shocked Bethany, and probably most people who thought they knew me. Morrison Holdings, LLC, Sarah began, pointing to the top of the chart. Your primary investment vehicle, established 6 years ago. Current asset value, $8.7 million. The chart branched out into dozens of subsidiaries and affiliated companies. Real estate investments in 3 states, technology startups in Silicon Valley, a portfolio of dividend-paying stocks, international mutual funds, even a small stake in a luxury resort in Costa Rica. Bethany knew about none of this, Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. She never asked, I replied. In 26 years of marriage, she never once inquired about my business activities beyond their ability to fund her lifestyle. She knew I worked in financial services, but she assumed that meant I was a glorified accountant rather than someone who built wealth. Sarah clicked to the next slide, showing the income breakdown. My salary from my day job, the only income Bethany knew about, represented less than 30% of my total annual earnings. The rest came from investment returns, business partnerships, consulting fees, and real estate income that flowed through various corporate entities. Your annual income last year was $2.1 million, Sarah said. Bethany had access to approximately $600,000 of that through household accounts and credit cards. The rest was reinvested or held in accounts she didn't know existed. I had learned years ago to keep my financial life compartmentalized. What started as a simple desire to have some independence had evolved into a comprehensive strategy for protecting myself from someone who viewed money as an infinite resource that existed solely for her benefit. Every time Bethany had demanded a larger house, more expensive vacations, or increased spending money, I had been able to provide it without touching the foundation I was building for my actual future. The Costa Rica investment is particularly interesting, Sarah continued, clicking to a new slide that showed photographs of a boutique resort nestled in the mountains overlooking the Pacific Ocean. 37 rooms, full-service spa, organic farm, private beach access. You own 18% through Morrison Holdings. I studied the images, infinity pools reflecting tropical sunsets, elegant villas surrounded by lush gardens, sophisticated guests enjoying world-class amenities. It represented everything Bethany claimed to value: luxury, beauty, sophistication, international appeal. The irony was that I had built it while she was spending my money on temporary pleasures that provided no lasting value. "What's the annual return?" I asked. 14% last year, projected 16% this year. Costa Rican ecotourism is expanding rapidly, and this property is positioned perfectly for high-end clientele. My phone buzzed with another message from Bethany. "Glenn, I know you're getting these texts. We need to talk about a reasonable settlement. I can't live without any income." I showed the message to Sarah, who shook her head with disgust. "Still no acknowledgement of what she did to you," Sarah observed. "Still no apology. Just demands that you continue funding her lifestyle even after she publicly humiliated you and filed for divorce." That was the pattern with Bethany. Consequences were always someone else's responsibility. When her first attempt at starting a fashion business had failed 8 years ago, she had blamed the economic climate rather than her lack of business knowledge. When her pottery phase had ended with thousands of dollars in unused supplies, she had blamed the instructor for not properly encouraging her. Creativity. When her photography studio had closed after 6 months, she had blamed the location rather than her refusal to actually work with paying clients. "Show me the real estate portfolio," I said, wanting to see the complete picture of what I had built while playing the role of accommodating husband. Sarah clicked to a new presentation that displayed property holdings across New York, Florida, and California, a waterfront condo in Miami that I rented to vacation tourists, a duplex in Brooklyn that provided steady rental income from young professionals, a small apartment building in San Diego that had appreciated 60% in value over 4 years. Total real estate value, $3.2 million, Sarah reported. Annual rental income, $237,000, all properties owned through Morrison Holdings or affiliated LLCs. Each property had been purchased during a period when Bethany was focused on some new expensive hobby or social commitment. While she was spending $15,000 on a custom-designed craft room that she used twice, I was closing on investment properties that would provide income for decades. While she was planning $20,000 garden parties to impress her friends, I was building a portfolio that would ensure my financial independence regardless of what happened in my marriage. The technology investments have performed exceptionally well, Sarah continued, displaying a chart showing the growth of our Silicon Valley portfolio. The artificial intelligence startup you invested in 3 years ago has increased 460% in value. The renewable energy company is up 280%. Even the failed ventures provided useful tax offsets. I had learned to identify promising startups through my work in financial services, often investing smaller amounts in multiple companies rather than betting everything on single opportunities, while Bethany was buying designer handbags that lost value the moment she carried them out of the store. I was funding innovations that would shape the future of technology and energy. "What's the current total net worth?" I asked, though I already knew the approximate figure. $11.3 million as of yesterday's closing markets, Sarah replied, not including the pending intellectual property valuations or the new opportunities we've discussed. $11.3 million. Built quietly over 6 years while Bethany spent her days at spas and shopping centers, convinced that my only value was my willingness to pay her bills. She had been living with someone worth over $11 million while treating him like a convenient servant. My phone rang. Richard Sterling, my attorney and oldest friend. I answered immediately. "Glenn, we need to talk," Richard said, his voice carrying the weight of recent developments. "Bethany's attorney wants to schedule a settlement conference. They're claiming she deserves half of everything based on the length of the marriage." I put the phone on speaker so Sarah could hear the conversation. "What exactly are they claiming she contributed to justify that?" "That's the interesting part," Richard replied. "They're arguing that her emotional support and social contributions during the marriage entitle her to half of all marital assets. They seem to believe that being married to you for 26 years automatically makes her a co-owner of wealth she never knew existed." Sarah and I exchanged glances. The legal strategy was predictable but absurd. Bethany's attorney was trying to position her as a supportive spouse who had sacrificed her own career opportunities to help me build success, rather than acknowledging the reality that she had contributed nothing while taking everything. "Do they have any documentation to support that theory?" I asked. "None. In fact, the evidence suggests exactly the opposite. The recordings you provided show her consistently expressing contempt for your work and dismissing your achievements. The financial records prove that she was a drain on resources rather than a contributor to building them." I looked at the organizational chart still displayed on Sarah's screen, millions of dollars in assets built through careful planning, strategic thinking, and disciplined execution. Bethany had been physically present during the years when this wealth was created, but her contribution had been entirely negative. She had actively discouraged me from taking risks, criticized my business decisions, and demanded that I prioritize her immediate desires over long-term financial planning. "There's something else," Richard continued. "They're threatening to go public with claims that you hid assets during the marriage. They want to paint this as a case of financial abuse, where you secretly moved money to prevent her from accessing it." Let them try, I replied calmly. Every transaction is documented and legal. Every asset was acquired with money I earned from work she had no involvement in. The only thing I hid was my competence, and that's not a crime. Sarah leaned toward the phone. Richard, it's Sarah Kim. I've prepared a complete financial timeline showing exactly when each asset was acquired and how it was funded. There's no evidence of any attempt to defraud Bethany or hide marital assets. Glenn simply built wealth through investments and business activities that she chose not to participate in or even acknowledge. Perfect, Richard said. That's exactly what we need. Can you have the documentation ready for tomorrow's meeting? Already prepared, Sarah confirmed. Everything is organized chronologically with supporting evidence. They'll see that Glenn's wealth was built through legitimate business activities, not hidden marital assets. After ending the call with Richard, I stood up and walked to the windows overlooking the financial district. 47 floors below, the streets bustled with people building careers, creating value, working toward their own versions of success. Somewhere out there, Bethany was probably trying to figure out how to pay for lunch without access to my credit cards. Do you regret any of it? Sarah asked quietly, joining me at the window. I considered the question carefully. Did I regret 26 years of enabling someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource? Did I regret building wealth that would now have to be protected through divorce proceedings? Did I regret the years of patient planning that had led to this moment? I regret that it took me so long to understand who she really was, I replied. But I don't regret protecting myself once I figured it out. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. She had watched me transform over the past 2 years, from someone who accepted disrespect as the price of marriage to someone who valued himself enough to demand better. What happens next? She asked. I turned back to the conference table, looking at the evidence of everything I had accomplished while Bethany was taking me for granted. Tomorrow she would learn the true scope of what she had lost when she decided to discard the nobody husband who had been building an empire right under her nose. Tomorrow we show them exactly what they're not going to get. Chapter 5. The Complete Collapse. The settlement conference took place in Richard Sterling's law offices on a gray Thursday morning in April, 6 weeks after Bethany's disastrous launch party. I arrived early, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 2 years of meticulous documentation, evidence that would destroy any claim Bethany might have to the wealth she had never known existed. Richard's conference room occupied a corner of the 43rd floor with windows overlooking Central Park. The mahogany table could seat 12 people, but today it would host a much smaller gathering that would determine the financial future of my failed marriage. Sarah sat beside me, her laptop open to spreadsheets that detailed every asset, every investment, every dollar that I had built, while Bethany was spending her days in luxury spas and boutique stores. At exactly 10 a.m., Bethany arrived with her attorney, Margaret Walsh, a woman in her 50s who specialized in high-asset divorce cases. What struck me immediately was how much Bethany had changed in just 6 weeks. The designer clothes had been replaced with a simple black dress that I recognized from 3 years ago. Her jewelry was minimal. Gone were the diamond earrings and tennis bracelet that had been constant accessories. Even her hair looked different, styled simply rather than professionally maintained. More telling was her expression. The arrogant confidence that had characterized our marriage had been replaced by something approaching desperation. She avoided eye contact as she took her seat across from me, her hands trembling slightly as she opened a worn leather portfolio. "Thank you all for coming," Richard began, his voice formal and professional. "We're here to discuss the terms of dissolution for the marriage of Glenn and Bethany Morrison. Mrs. Morrison has filed a petition requesting equal division of marital assets, ongoing spousal support, and exclusive use of the marital home. Mr. Morrison's response contests these requests based on documented evidence of misconduct and misrepresentation." Margaret Walsh leaned forward aggressively. "My client contributed 26 years of her life to this marriage. She provided emotional support, managed the household, and sacrificed her own career opportunities to help Mr. Morrison achieve success. She's entitled to half of everything they built together. Sarah opened her laptop and connected it to the room's display system. The first slide that appeared showed a timeline of our marriage alongside my asset, accumulation. The evidence was devastating in its simplicity. Mrs. Morrison's contributions, Sarah said, her voice calm and factual, can be documented very precisely. Let's start with household management. The next slide showed receipts and invoices for every household service over the past 10 years. Cleaning service, $96,000, landscaping and maintenance, $74,000, personal shopping and errands service, $53,000. Interior design consultation, $89,000. Every aspect of household management was outsourced to paid professionals, Sarah continued. Mrs. Morrison's role was limited to selecting service providers and approving expenses using Mr. Morrison's money. Bethany shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Margaret Walsh pressed on. Career sacrifices are still valid grounds for spousal support. My client gave up professional opportunities to support the marriage. Richard opened his own laptop and pulled up employment records. Mrs. Morrison has been employed for a total of 8 months during the 26-year marriage. 3 months as a sales associate at a boutique in 2007, 2 months as a pottery instructor in 2012, and 3 months as a photography assistant in 2018. Her longest period of employment ended when she quit because the work schedule interfered with her vacation plans. I watched Bethany's face as her employment history was laid out with clinical precision. She had spent decades claiming that she would work if she could find something meaningful and fulfilling while refusing any job that required consistent attendance or effort. "What about emotional support?" Margaret asked, growing more defensive. Sarah clicked to a new presentation, audio recordings of conversations between Bethany and her friends over the past 18 months. I had obtained these legally through Vivian Torres, Bethany's closest friend who had grown disgusted with Bethany's treatment of me and agreed to cooperate with the divorce proceedings. The first recording played Bethany's voice, clear and unmistakable. Glenn is such a pathetic little man. No ambition, no excitement, no passion for anything except his boring spreadsheets. Sometimes I think about what my life could have been if I'd married someone with actual vision. The second recording was even more damaging. "I'm counting the days until I can dump him and take half of everything. He's so weak and grateful for any attention that he'll never see it coming. Men like Glenn deserve to be used. They're too stupid to demand better treatment." The silence in the room was profound. Margaret Walsh's face had gone pale as she realized that her client had been recorded expressing contempt and calculated exploitation. Bethany was staring at the table, unable to look at anyone. "Emotional support," Richard said dryly, "appears to have been notably absent from this marriage." Sarah continued the presentation with financial evidence that demonstrated Bethany's systematic abuse of my generosity. Credit card statements showing purchases of $15,000 handbags while I packed lunches to save money. Spa receipts totaling $47,000 in a single year while I wore the same suits for 5 years. Vacation expenses of $38,000 for trips she took with friends while I worked extra hours to fund her lifestyle. The total amount Mrs. Morrison spent on personal luxuries over the past 5 years, Sarah announced, was $683,000. This does not include household expenses, utilities, or necessities, only designer clothes, jewelry, spa treatments, entertainment, and personal travel. Margaret Walsh was frantically taking notes, clearly realizing that her client had misrepresented the nature of the marriage. What about Mr. Morrison's assets? Even if my client made mistakes, she's still entitled to half of the marital property. This was the moment I had been waiting for. Sarah clicked to the comprehensive asset disclosure that would shock everyone in the room except Richard and me. "Mr. Morrison's total net worth as of yesterday's market close," Sarah announced, "is $11.7 million. Bethany's head snapped up. her eyes wide with disbelief. Margaret Walsh dropped her pen, staring at the screen as if the numbers were written in a foreign language. "That's impossible," Bethany whispered. "Glenn doesn't have that kind of money." Sarah's presentation detailed every asset, every investment, every business holding that I had accumulated while Bethany was treating me like a financial servant. The Costa Rica resort investment, now worth $2.1 million. The technology startup portfolio, valued at $3.4 million. The real estate holdings across 3 states generating $257,000 in annual rental income. Every asset was acquired using income from Mr. Morrison's work and business activities, Sarah explained. Mrs. Morrison was unaware of these holdings because she never expressed interest in her husband's business affairs beyond their ability to fund her spending. Margaret Walsh reviewed the documentation, her expression growing more concerned with each page. "How do we know these assets weren't hidden intentionally to avoid marital property laws?" Richard opened a thick folder containing tax returns, business documents, and financial statements going back 8 years. Every transaction was properly reported to the IRS and state tax authorities. Every investment was documented through legitimate financial institutions. Every business entity was legally established and registered. Mrs. Morrison's ignorance of her husband's success doesn't constitute evidence of concealment. It demonstrates her complete lack of involvement in the marriage partnership. The evidence was overwhelming. While Bethany had been spending her days shopping and socializing, I had been building an empire that she never bothered to understand or appreciate. While she was complaining to friends about being married to someone boring, I was making investment decisions that created more wealth than she had ever imagined. "There's one more element to consider," Richard continued, opening another file. "Mrs. Morrison's affair with Marcus Chen." He placed photographs on the table, images of Bethany and Marcus at expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, and weekend getaways. Every receipt showed charges to credit cards in my name. Mrs. Morrison used marital funds to finance her extramarital relationship, Richard explained. Hotel rooms, dinners, gifts, travel expenses, all charged to accounts funded by Mr. Morrison's income. The total amount spent on the affair over 8 months was $23,000. Bethany was now crying quietly, mascara streaking down her cheeks as the full scope of her exposure became clear. She had not only been unfaithful, she had used my money to pay for her betrayal. Margaret Walsh closed her notepad and looked directly at her client. "Mrs. Morrison, I need to speak with you privately." They left the conference room for 15 minutes, during which Sarah and I reviewed the final elements of our presentation. When they returned, Margaret's expression had changed completely. "My client would like to revise her requests," Margaret announced. "Given the evidence presented, we're prepared to accept a settlement that provides temporary spousal support for 2 years, allowing Mrs. Morrison time to establish financial independence." Richard shook his head. "Mr. Morrison's position is that Mrs. Morrison has no valid claim to assets she didn't help create, didn't know existed, and actively undermined through her conduct. His counteroffer is simple. Mrs. Morrison receives no spousal support, no property division, and no claim to any assets. In exchange, Mr. Morrison will not pursue legal action for the recovery of funds she diverted to finance her affair." The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Bethany looked at her attorney desperately, but Margaret Walsh had clearly realized that fighting would only expose her client to additional liability. "We need time to consider this," Margaret said finally. "You have until 5 p.m. tomorrow," Richard replied. "After that, we proceed to trial, where all of this evidence becomes public record." As we prepared to leave, Bethany finally spoke directly to me for the first time since entering the room. "Glenn, please," she said, her voice breaking. "We were married for 26 years. That has to count for something." I looked at her across the conference table, this woman who had spent decades treating me with contempt while spending my money and planning my destruction. For a moment I felt something that might have been pity. "It counted for everything," I replied quietly. "Until you decided it counted for nothing." I gathered my papers and walked out of the room, leaving behind the wreckage of a marriage that had been dead for years before either of us was brave enough to admit it. 2 hours later, my phone buzzed with a text from Margaret Walsh. "Client accepts terms. Will sign settlement agreement tomorrow." It was over. After 26 years of enabling someone who saw me as nothing more than a financial resource, I was finally free to build a life with someone who valued me for more than my bank account. The woman who thought she was discarding a nobody husband had just discovered that she had thrown away the most successful man she would ever know. Chapter 6. The New Beginning. 6 months later, I stood on the balcony of my penthouse apartment overlooking the Hudson River, watching the sun set over Manhattan while Sarah prepared dinner in the kitchen behind me. The apartment was everything our old house had never been. Peaceful, authentic, filled with things I had chosen because I loved them rather than because they impressed other people. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks ago with no media attention, no drama, and no last-minute attempts by Bethany to renegotiate the settlement. She had signed the papers accepting 0 spousal support and no claim to any assets. Understanding finally that fighting would only expose her to additional humiliation and potential legal liability for the affair expenses. I had kept my promise not to pursue recovery of the $23,000 she had spent financing her relationship with Marcus Chen, though that relationship had ended exactly as I had predicted. The moment Marcus realized that Bethany had no access to money and no prospect of future wealth, he had moved on to another target, a gallery owner in Soho who was still married to someone with actual financial resources. "Dinner's ready," Sarah called from the kitchen, her voice warm and affectionate, in a way that reminded me daily of what I had been missing during my marriage. We had been living together for 4 months now, and every day reinforced my understanding of what a genuine partnership actually looked like. I walked into the dining room where Sarah had set the table with simple elegance, good food, excellent wine, and the kind of comfortable atmosphere that comes from being with someone who appreciates you for who you are rather than what you can provide. She was wearing jeans and a cashmere sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders, looking more beautiful than Bethany ever had in all her designer outfits and professional styling. "How was your day?" she asked as we sat down to grilled salmon and roasted vegetables. A meal she had prepared herself rather than ordering from an expensive restaurant or hiring a personal chef. "Productive," I replied, pouring wine for both of us. "The Costa Rica resort expansion is moving ahead of schedule. The renewable energy portfolio gained another 8%, and Richard called with news about Bethany." Sarah raised an eyebrow, though she no longer showed the concern she had expressed months ago about my ex-wife's well-being. We had both learned that Bethany was remarkably resourceful when forced to be, just not in ways that created value for anyone except herself. "She's moved in with her sister in Connecticut," I continued. "Vivian Torres mentioned it when I ran into her at the coffee shop near my office. Apparently Bethany is working part-time at a boutique and complaining constantly about how unfair her life has become." Sarah nodded, without surprise. "Some people never learn to take responsibility for their own choices. Has she tried to contact you directly?" "Not in 6 weeks," I said. "I think she finally understands that there's nothing left to negotiate. No money to access, no leverage to exploit, no reason for me to maintain any connection to her life." The relief in that statement was profound. For 26 years, I had carried the weight of someone else's demands, expectations, and constant dissatisfaction. Bethany had been like a black hole at the center of my life, absorbing energy and resources while contributing nothing but criticism and contempt. Now, for the first time since I was 27 years old, I was responsible only for my own happiness and the happiness of someone who actually cared about my well-being. "What about the business developments?" Sarah asked, cutting into her salmon with the precise movements that characterized everything she did. Even her eating habits reflected the discipline and attention to detail that made her one of the most successful wealth managers in the city. "Morrison Holdings closed the acquisition of the second Costa Rica property yesterday," I reported. 32 rooms, private beach access, organic farm that supplies 3 high-end art, Restaurants in San Jose. The sellers accepted our offer of $4.6 million, which gives us controlling interest in one of the fastest-growing ecotourism regions in Central America. Sarah smiled, understanding the significance of the expansion. While Bethany had been spending money on temporary pleasures that provided no lasting value, Sarah and I were building assets that would generate income and appreciate in value for decades. The difference between working with a partner who understood wealth creation versus someone who only understood wealth consumption was transformative. The technology investments are performing even better than projected, I continued. The artificial intelligence startup we increased our position in last month just signed a contract with Microsoft worth $57 million. Our 18% stake is now worth approximately $3.2 million. What I didn't mention, because Sarah already knew, was that every investment decision was made jointly. Unlike my marriage, where Bethany had demanded access to spending money while showing zero interest in how that money was created, my relationship with Sarah was built on shared understanding and mutual respect for each other's expertise. "I have news too," Sarah said, refilling our wine glasses. "The Swiss Banking Consortium accepted our proposal for the International Fund. They're committing $250 million to start, with expansion potential to $500 million within 2 years." This was the opportunity we had been working toward for 8 months. Establishing our own private wealth management firm that would serve ultra-high net worth clients who valued discretion and personalized service. Sarah's reputation in the industry, combined with my investment success, had attracted attention from some of the world's most sophisticated investors. "When do we start?" I asked, though I already knew the answer would change our lives in ways that Bethany could never have imagined or appreciated. "January 1st, Sarah replied. "Kim Morrison Capital Management, equal partners in everything. Equal partners." Those words represented something I had never experienced during my marriage. Bethany had been an expensive dependent, not a partner. She had contributed criticism, not collaboration. She had demanded support without providing it. Sarah represented everything I had been missing: intelligence, ambition, integrity, and genuine affection for the person I actually was, rather than the lifestyle I could provide. My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at the screen out of habit. The message was from Vivian Torres. "Bethany asked me to contact you. She wants to know if you'd be willing to have lunch and clear the air between you. She says she's learned from her mistakes and wants to apologize properly." I showed the message to Sarah, who read it with an expression of mild amusement. "What do you think?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew my answer. "I think some people confuse consequences with mistakes," I replied, deleting the message without responding. Bethany didn't make mistakes, she made choices. For 26 years, she chose to treat me with contempt while spending my money. She chose to pursue affairs while demanding my financial support. She chose to plan a public humiliation as her exit strategy. Those weren't mistakes. They were decisions that reflected who she really is. Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. She had witnessed enough divorce proceedings to recognize the pattern of abusers who suddenly discovered remorse when faced with permanent consequences. "The only mistake," I continued, "was mine. I enabled her behavior for too long because I confused loyalty with weakness and generosity with love." We finished dinner while discussing our plans for the new business, the international travel it would require, and the life we were building together. Every conversation with Sarah reminded me of what I had been missing during my marriage: genuine intellectual connection with someone who valued partnership over parasitism. Later that evening, we sat on the balcony overlooking the river, Sarah reading investment reports while I reviewed architectural plans for the Costa Rica resort expansion. The comfortable silence between us was something I had never experienced with Bethany, who had required constant entertainment and attention. "Do you ever regret how it ended?" Sarah asked during a lull in our work. I considered the question seriously, thinking about the 26 years I had spent trying to make someone happy who was determined to be dissatisfied. I thought about the money I had wasted on designer clothes and luxury vacations for someone who treated me like a walking ATM. I thought about the nights I had worked late to fund her lifestyle while she complained to friends about being married to someone boring. I regret that it took me so long to understand my own worth, I replied, but I don't regret protecting myself once I figured it out. The city lights reflected on the water below us, creating patterns that shifted and changed with each passing boat. Somewhere out there, Bethany was probably still telling anyone who would listen about how unfairly she had been treated, still convinced that being married to me for 26 years entitled her to half of wealth she had never helped create. But that was no longer my problem. For the first time in my adult life, I was responsible only for my own happiness and the happiness of someone who genuinely cared about my well-being. "What are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, closing her laptop and moving closer to me on the outdoor sofa. "The future," I replied, putting my arm around her and feeling the contentment that comes from being with someone who sees you clearly and chooses to stay. All the possibilities we're going to explore together. Sarah smiled and settled against my shoulder, both of us watching the lights of the city reflect on the dark water. Tomorrow we would continue building something real, something valuable, something based on mutual respect and shared goals rather than exploitation and contempt. The woman who had discarded me as a nobody husband was now working part-time retail while complaining about the unfairness of life. The man she had dismissed as boring and unsuccessful was building an international business with someone who appreciated both his intelligence and his integrity.